I mean, I agree to some extent that there needs to be some regulation of the internet. The internet is somewhat different from the rest of the world. You need, from, let's say, a print publication. You need to be able to act faster if something gets published on the internet, which, for example, is defamatory or which is obscene or which has direct a result of creating racial hatred, for example, or these kind of things. You need to be able to act fast, and most of the content is hosted by intermediaries such as Google, etc. And you don't want Google or Yahoo to be liable for that content necessarily, which is posted by a third party. So the IT Act in Section 79, I believe, is actually the intent behind it is somewhat justifiable. We need to protect and have a safe harbor for people who host this information, yet we need to have some recourse to allow that information to be taken down. Now, having that is no problem at all, and the UK has a very similar law. You can do that also under existing defamation laws, for example, that you can say this is defamatory against us, therefore take it down, and any intermediary will have to comply with that.
But now, so far, the way it exists, it makes companies like Google, Yahoo, Facebook, Twitter responsible.
It makes them responsible in, again, the chilling effect I think that it has, is that they have to be proactive in responding to these requests, because if they don't, they will be liable under it. And because the Act as well, I think another weakness, not just the vague wording that is in there, but another big weakness is that there's no real redressal process that exists within the Act to say, for Google, say, to come back to someone who's issuing a takedown request, to say, I don't agree with this takedown request, let me alert the person who posted the content and let's discuss it with them, let's have a third party arbitrate what's going on.
There's no provision as such. Arbitrary at this point.
And I think probably, I mean, it's up to Google to a larger extent to decide, is this right or is it not right? I think 33% or something like that of government takedown requests from India were actually complied with. That means 67% or some number around that was erroneous or was complete nonsense in Google's eyes. But we don't really know. But I think it's interesting, though, to contrast, if you're mentioning foreign perspectives, for example, something that's been somewhat successful but also criticized quite a lot is the DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, I believe. And under that, which was essentially lobbied through by copyrights holders, movie industry, music industry, these kind of people, and it has also been implemented in Europe in a similar form, is that you can issue takedown requests to say, I am the rightful copyright holder. And then whoever has published that information, let's say Google is hosting it on one of their servers, they can go back to the copyright holder and they can say, okay, we're investigating your request. It will be taken down, and we have contacted the person who has published that information, and we're negotiating with them to find out exactly whether that information is violating copyright or not. Now, people have complained again that it puts the burden of proof on the person who has published the information in the first place, that they have to justify that the copyright is actually not anyone's, or that the request is wrong.
But at least they're not arrested.
They're not arrested,
they're not put in jail and then have to explain themselves
later. And there's at least a
later.
dispute resolution mechanism. I mean, it's sort of front-loaded possibly, that I have to prove that this information is correct, whereas a copyright holder can just go around and fire notices willy-nilly, which they are actually doing. They're just running a Google search, anything that remotely looks like copyrighted content, they're saying this should be removed. And that's also creating a sort of distorting effect and is creating injustice. But at least there's a mechanism in place for resolving the dispute, whereas under the IT Act, I believe there's the IT Appellate Tribunal, or Cyber Appellate Tribunal, which is an absolute nonsense entity. I mean, I found out myself before it about 2 years ago, where a lawyer issued an injunction against us, quoting the IT Act. And you're not really allowed to issue an injunction on the Appellate Tribunal, but for some reason the Appellate Tribunal issued an injunction against us to publish anything relating to a dispute with this lawyer. Now, I think as a mechanism, it's inadequate. It's not actually doing its job. And that's why there's all these hundreds and thousands of requests, and probably more that we don't even know about, that service providers and intermediaries are just acquiescing to and saying, we don't want any trouble. We're removing this information, and maybe next week we can find something that's more important. And there's probably a lot of information that's just being suppressed and that's disappearing because no one can be bothered to fight it. And there's no actual steps to fight it. Now, that's another real weakness of the law. Apart from there's the vagueness adds on top of it. And I would argue also, just for 1 second, that if a law is so vague that you can't actually read it properly and find out what it's supposed to be doing, then it's a bad law. And I think a lot of jurisprudence would agree with that. That if you have a law which is so wide that anyone can use it for any purpose whatsoever.
Which is what has happened.
To some extent, yes. And maybe it's malice or maybe it's just incompetence. I don't know which is more worrying.
It doesn't take incompetence to go out of your way to go and arrest 2 women. That is
but that is incompetence.
motivating.
I mean, actually, it's complete incompetence, because what have they actually achieved by arresting these two women? If anything, this Streisand effect, which everyone knows about, I mean, that you do something bad, you try to ban it, and then whatever the thing that you didn't want out will be written about by every media out there, and they will complain about it. And that, I think, is where India is quite strong and much more powerful position than, let's say, China, because the media is quite happy, especially online, to jump on the back of these kind of things. Asim Trivedi, and I mean, who would have heard of Asim Trivedi's cartoon if they hadn't tried to ban it? Again, I think these are actually stupid decisions and incompetence of local government officials who say, oh, there's this law, some lawyer is advising them you can use this to try and get this content removed. They get very excited. They do it, and then it blows up all over the newspaper, and they end up with egg on their face. I mean, it hasn't done any politicians any favors, I think.
Aman, what would you say is the motivation behind these amendments? Why do you think, can you say, you seem to think that they're necessary and successful. Why do you think that?
No, I think that because I personally think you can't possibly give a license for a person to either be false in his statements, be menacing in whatever he's saying, or for that being offensive. There's no right to do that in any case, and that is what this particular section targets. And so far as the availability of the machinery is concerned, please understand these acts are not in vacuum. They're in a context, and as very rightly pointed out, that we are a vibrant democracy. We've got a very alive press. Now that itself is a deterrent to abuse, in so that is concerned. So it is in that environment that we have an act like this. If supposing in a Chinese environment we have an act like this, even an innocuous act, it can be abused in a far more severe manner than this particular act is. Now we have some inherent checks. We got a very alert court. We got an alert press. We got an alert population. Now these are the checks which are over there, which is the reason why whenever there is abuse, there's noise. And because there is noise, there is correction. Now because there is noise, there is correction, you possibly have to have a law with the checks in place as they are to deal with a wrong. Now if you look at this particular act, the point is that we always look at the act and say that the section is wrong. If we read this section to say that the section is not a wrong, the section is meant to address a wrong. In that event, you have a stronger case to prevent abuse.
So you are repeating yourself, and I think Gyan answered that argument twice over, that he did say that the loosely worded amendment doesn't work.
In logic, this is called circular reasoning. Circular reasoning is having the conclusion in the premises. If I start with the assumption that the act is bad, my conclusion is, of course, it's horrible.
But can we actually look at the act?
Insofar as the act is concerned,
let's look at the act. Do we have
grossly
a copy of the
offensive
act?
and menacing. This is not, as far as grossly offensive is concerned, grossly offensive is used
I believe there's also obnoxious or...
There's inconvenience.
No, that's the problem. Now,
Inconvenience and annoyance.
Oh, please read the whole section.
But let's
Harry
read the whole
Potter
section.
fan fiction would be
Let's take these words.
Now it talks about
Inconvenience.
first false. Read the section. Please
All
read
right,
the clause.
all right. But
it should be false.
It can
should
be any of
persistent.
these. It doesn't mean have to be all
Provided it
together.
is false and consistent, persistent.
So does it not use the
False,
word all?
false and
One
persistent.
second. The two girls who put their
That is misuse. That is abuse. I'm not saying this is not abused. We have to deal with the question of abuse. Now, the question is that we have to understand who our target is.
Okay, shall I read it out? 66A?
give it to him so that he can tell us.
Now, insofar as 66A is concerned, any information
would be great.
Yeah, any information that is grossly offensive or menacing in character. Now, grossly offensive.
No, that's 66A, clause A. If you could go to C and.
C is not relevant. The problem, I don't know what kind of research. As far as C is concerned, C is dealing with spams. We have to deal with B, not C. Now, I'll read B. Any information which he knows to be false, let's just see this. C is not relevant to this controversy, it's B, not C. Any information which he knows to be false. Now the first thing is the information should be known to be false.
No, it does not mean
any information which he knows to be false.
Sorry,
this is what the section is saying.
No, it does not preclude. It doesn't mean. One second.
Oh, you can't say no to a section.
No,
the provision is saying any information.
Excuse me 1 second.
Yeah.
It does not mean it has to first be false before you take action.
What does it mean? When you read a statute,
it can also
may I answer?
No, can I raise the question?
Yeah.
It can also be inconvenient alone. It doesn't have to be false and inconvenient.
No,
what you're saying is it has to be false
You cannot ever read
arrest.
a law. There's a principle of law. You can't ever read a law as to render any part of it irrelevant or redundant. If there's any provision in a statute, that provision has to be given a
Nowhere
meaning.
does it say that it has to be included together.
No, do you have to read it in that manner?
Nowhere does it say it
If
has
the
to be
word or
included
is
together.
used, then
You have to,
then it is either or,
No,
and if the word and is used, then it's both.
Didn't you know the clause, madam? I mean, referring to B or talking about B.
I'll read it out.
any information which he knows
is well
to be
written?
false.
I mean,
No,
I think
I'm sorry,
is it well
this is-
written? Does it actually make complete
No,
sense?
what I'm saying is let's leave this.
It's
for a
badly
time.
written, right? We can agree on
yes,
that.
I agree. And so far that question is concerned, what I'm saying is you have to read it.
Why would you want a law like this?
I don't know. I am not obsessed or fixated with law like this.
Okay,
All
then
I'm
please
saying
let's say
is,
it
says
really
that-
is. It is causing us great annoyance and inconvenience. We really don't want this.
very well. You finding it annoying and inconvenient. The
No, I
opinion
just-
is yours. And so far as this
I want to
particular-
ask you that every time, if the law says that any person who sends A or B or C, does it mean A and B and C, or does it mean A or
talk
B?
in the context of the section because the occasions will be myriad. So we have to.
It
deal with-
uses the word or.
We have
But
to
then
deal with
the
the
court has to
situation
fix
as
it,
is.
right?
Rather than talk about things generally. you have
No,
to
no, I'm
talk
not.
about
I'm
the
talking
situation
about
of
this
the section.
section. I'm trying
But
to
then
save
the court
time.
has to fix that section. I mean, the way it's being read right now in literal reading for any 5-year-old would read it and they would say, this doesn't make any sense. I mean, we can give it to a court, and you might be right that the court might say this has to be an and rather than or because there's no reasonable way we'd interpret it like that. But that actually means that the law is bad, that it's not working.
Aman, where
as
does
it currently
satire
is,
fall
right?
in this?
No, satire will not
Satire
be-
is false?
No. Satire is not this question. When you read a section, you have to read a section. The object is when this satire is not part of 66A. And
It
it's
could
satire.
be, under this interpretation,
No,
it could be because
no,
it
that's
is
a question
false.
of
It will cause inconvenience and it will cause annoyance.
Satire will be known to be a satire. When it is known to be a satire, the question is implicit in it that the representation is a distortion, and the distortion is supposed to convey a message. It is not. This talks about when you talk about criminal offences,
But explain-
intent.
Aren't
Please
there
understand.
several
You can
rules of
never.
interpretation?
I mean, I think the difficulty is try explaining that to, let's say, a policeman
That's
when
what
you're
I'm
filing
saying.
an
You're
FIR.
absolutely right. I
To say
agree
this
with
is
you.
not satire,
So-
and the policeman will say, okay, fine,
Exactly,
and it's not the
exactly. So
cleanest
that's the
system
reason why I
anyway,
said,
right?
and so far as these cases are concerned, before you proceed to arrest, you have to actually justify it and involve a magistrate, involve a court, so that insofar as the justification to proceed in that particular manner is concerned, that will not in any way encompass cases which entail abuse. Abuse is there, yes, but you can't simply say that you have to move in that
Chimai,
direction.
please.
Yeah, I mean, if we're saying that the law is so badly worded that you have to go to a higher court to get them
No,
to
the higher-
interpret
magistrate
an
is not
or,
the
may I
higher
finish,
court.
sir?
Please let us
To get an so normally when you read an or within a law, it means that you can either do A or do B or do C, and it's applicable. So for the court to choose to read it as A and B and C, you need a higher court to say that that's how we're going to
The
read
thing
it
is
in
that if we
66A.
look at this, right now, India is borderline in terms of the observances that people have made, societies and internet organizations have made on the net.
Yes.
That they have stated that we are borderline in terms of in between freedom and China. Now, what do you think in this situation? What do you think in this situation should be done in order to clean up this? That we do have the freedom of speech within the internet, but we do not cross the line in terms of creating violence, sending messages like fake videos that was done for Muzaffarnagar. What do you think is the solution for that? If you have an active government who can send counter messages right away and say this is a fake video, do not believe it, or what do you think is the solution in this? Because complete troublemaking freedom is not acceptable. Terrorists using websites to spread false information is not acceptable.
No.
But certainly government picking up people like cartoonists and two girls and anyone that personally attacks you, criticism of the government, which has been the majority, as you said, and we all know from the Google Transparency Report, this is what this section has been successful in doing so far. What do you think we should have?
The UN Special Rapporteur has laid down clear norms to a covenant that we've signed, that's the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. If we just follow those rules, they're as simple as make sure that your language is as clear and narrow as possible. Make it very clear to people, because even people need to know what kinds of speech are acceptable and what kinds of speech are not. So make it clear what kinds of speech are covered. Make sure that you categorize different kinds of speech into their appropriate categories. So just because something is offensive does not mean that you have to arrest people for it, because you have to be proportionate in the manner in which you react. Similarly, a video might trigger violence, but it may not be the only factor. So to address the video, you don't need to take, to address the violence, you don't need to take down the video sometimes. There are other less restrictive ways in which you can address the same problem. So the UN Special Rapporteur has said that you have to explore other means before you crack down on speech. There's a series of norms like that that also say that you have to be transparent about the kinds of speech that you're cracking down on. You have to use civil remedies like fines or allowing people to sue each other in certain situations versus, so for instance, defamation, you might be better off letting people address this on their own. If I defame you, you drag me to court instead of filing an FIR, getting me arrested and all of that. Whereas for more extreme a form of speech that actually results in violence. So if I'm releasing child pornography, for instance, that's actually harmful to a child. So for that, you could think about criminalizing it, because that's fair enough. We don't make those distinctions at all in Indian law right now. We don't choose to.
That's why it is so blurred. The requests are mixed up with pornography, critique of the government, mainly critique of the government, very few other requests. Aman, in this, what do you suggest should be done in order to stop the misuse? And do you think that the third parties such as Twitter, Facebook, Google, Yahoo, should they be responsible for what appears on their sites?
No, that is already covered by 79. That's the amendment that was made in the Act, not to make them directly responsible unless they participate. Now, first of all, as far as
that again has ambivalence, no?
Insofar as ambivalence is concerned, you see, the degrees, we go into a different realm altogether. It's not strictly relevant for this program as such, but that's the reason why 79 was brought in, for the purposes of ensuring that mainly because you carry will not necessarily be liable unless you participate in whatever is wrong. So that will be dealt with. Now, insofar as approving it is concerned, first of all, I think we as Indians are fixated with what outsiders do, what UN rapporteurs do, what Amnesty International does, what this we have to build.
No, I mean we are fixated with the people who are arrested.
No, we are
for
fixated.
No reason.
Yes, now, when insofar as the UN rapporteur is concerned, you see this, the example is given. The speech should be appropriate. Now, what is appropriate speech? That itself is moved.
You know what we're fixated on? That this government actually cut and pasted in 1835 Act.
I'm not holding a brief, Madhu. I'm not insofar as please understand. The question, not this question, is that we agree that there has to be some element of regulation. I don't think there can be any dispute that is concerned.
But is this the right regulation?
That, insofar as if supposing there are instances of abuse, in that event, if there is some general consensus as to manner in which we have to deal with it, in that event we may consider redrafting it. But the manner in which it stands today, it is dealing with, it has a particular purport and intent, which has been lost in the misuse.
Which has got misfired.
Which has got lost.
You would recommend it should be re-looked at.
It should be re-looked at in the context of in the context of what has happened. But you can't. And the focus has to be on the abuse. Because then you fix the abuse. You do recommend that it should be looked at again to prevent misuse. Of course, it can be looked at, but we need a provision like this.
What other journalists do is putting words in his mouth. So you do agree that it should be.
I would not debunk 66A altogether. At the same time, I would say that considering it's been abused, the fact is that
it should be looked at again.
We can do a rethink about it.
Jan, would you sum up?
A very quick thing, I think, like taking a step back. Things are not that bad overall in India, right, in terms of freedom of speech, in terms of, in fact, the freedom that journalists enjoy. Partly because the legal system is so slow and flawed in many ways, right? Defamation is practically impossible to get remedy under, unless you're very, very rich and you can fire off claims in Silchar or wherever you want and cause a general nuisance for the journalist. Actually getting false speech taken out of a newspaper or offline is very difficult. Fighting with Bennett Coleman or any of the other behemoths online, you're not going to stand much of a chance.
Well,
the average citizen...
Times of India, Bennett Coleman was asked to pay 200 crores. Yeah, 100
Sure, if you mess with the judiciary, for example, or whatever, if you pick the wrong battle.
That was a misstatement as to the identity of a person, so that's very
Remedies are there, and I think when there's clearly a wrong there, it's okay. But if you compare it to, let's say, libel laws in the UK, even after reform, Indian journalists and freedom of speech has had it pretty good, just because the system of enforcement wasn't there. And I think that's exactly the reason why the IT Act has been so popular, because the existing remedies are not effective, and I can't actually go to the courts to get most of the things taken down because it takes so long, and I'm likely to get stuck in court for 10, 20 years fighting this. And therefore everyone's very excited about the IT Act, especially the government, because they can get something done very quickly, very quietly, without very, very much debate, and the content disappears. Now, it's probably a good idea to have some alternative system of doing these kind of things because the courts are too slow. But I think I would agree in general that we need to look at again at how it's phrased and how it's actually implemented, because we have to work within the existing system that's there, how slow it is and how flawed in many ways as well. I mean, offenses like sedition also can result in imprisonment. It's not just the IT Act that gets people locked up.
Qualitatively different.
Yeah.
But in this situation, the government has put in laws in which arbitrarily websites are blocked, Twitter handles are blocked, and the sorting out comes much later, as you said. And if you're lucky, you get the press will cover it, and then you would be released or you'll get relief. Other than that, if you're quietly put away, nobody's going to know the difference.
There's huge potential for abuse.
It's a very serious problem here in terms of the fear of what could happen. And I think there's too much leeway in that. Do you agree? Yes, you do.
Yes.
Chinmay.
I agree mostly. I think that politicians everywhere, this was one of Kian's opening remarks, they always try to crack down on free speech. They tried it in the USA also with the Communications Decency Act, and the judgments that the US Supreme Court gave are the reason that that the internet is so well protected in the USA. Our own Supreme Court has said in the past, in the context of publishers, that we cannot regulate everybody's information such that it is fit for children, because adults obviously are entitled to read more. I think that that should apply to the internet. And I think that we live in a democracy, and we have a tendency to think like we live in a monarchy. It's not about what parliamentarians' intentions were. It's not about assuming that they will use the law in a bona fide way. It is about drafting the law in a way in which it is transparent, accountable, and in keeping with international human rights norms, which are the treaties that we sign. So the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights isn't a random treaty that I pulled out of the back of my head. It's a right that we have, it's a covenant that we have signed, and the Supreme Court has on occasion said that we need to uphold it and integrate it within the manner in which our law functions.
And the international human rights is obviously has to be read into it, but as far as human rights, freedom, it's been interpreted by the European Union, it's been interpreted by the Supreme Court of India, it's been interpreted by the American Supreme Court. And so far as our law is concerned, our law is in sync with contemporary understanding of the law. There may be issues with particular enactments which can be looked into, but you can't simply say that insofar as the norm is concerned, the norm is a violent departure or completely different from what is otherwise acceptable the world over.
Well, first of all, when it was passed, it was done in such a sneaky way, and in a last-minute way, so there was no, the press was not alerted, there was no debate, and for very good reason, because they knew that if it was debated, nobody would have allowed such a vague, ambiguous act, and that is the problem. Thank you very much, Chinmay. Thank you, Aman, for bringing color to this and disagreeing with everybody. Thank you very much, Kian.